Aloha and welcome back to The Creative Life, produced by the American Creativity Association's Austin Global Chapter, brought to you in partnership with ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Phyllis Blees. Our guest today is Susan Taylor. She's the CEO of Generon International, a boutique international consulting firm for organizational culture development. Today, we're going to talk about the way of dialogue and learn how to chase the light. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a moment. Aloha, Susan, and mahalo for being our guest today.
Thank you, Phyllis. I feel really grateful to be here.
Oh, good. Well, and to get started, I want to ask you about something that you said when we were preparing for the show. You said you were born with a burning desire to chase the light, but that since then, you've learned that chasing the light always comes with a shadow, and that is part of the territory. Why did you reflect on that as we prepared for today's show on the way of dialogue?
Yeah, so I have had an amazing experience with regard to understanding my purpose, if you will, at a very, very young age. I was about 5 years old. And as part of that, feeling like I knew my reason for existing at such a young age came with a bit of a double-edged sword. And what I mean by that is my whole reason for being is around harmony. So when I was 5, we were on our way to a cheese factory in Wisconsin over the weekend with my parents. And we stopped at a stoplight. And I looked to my right and I saw a billboard with a Native American chief with a tear running down his cheek. And for those of you who are of my age, you will know that that was a public service announcement with regard to littering. Yet when I saw the tear on the cheek and I looked through the window, which was covered in raindrops because it was a very, very rainy day, for some reason, I just knew that I was here to somehow create harmony. And in my own way of thinking about it as a child, I wanted everybody to be happy and to be loving and caring with each other. So as I grew up, the reason why I say it's a double-edged sword and why I chased the light is because in doing so, I felt like I had to operate and be a certain way with regard to everything being very positive. And what I learned was that chasing that light also came with a shadow, because you can't have a shadow without being in that light. And I learned a lot of things with regard to different opportunities for vulnerability and understanding that maybe I had to not be that thing that I was trying to become because of that purpose that I felt, but instead understanding more deeply that I needed to be on a journey in a way that was also going to bring up some of the shadow part of what it means to be in the light.
So vulnerability is part of it feels like you're in the shadow. We're hearing from Brene Brown that it's quite the opposite, that we're
Exactly.
showing our authentic self, and people are more interested in our persona stepping into our vulnerability or our shadow side. And yet you're expressing how we all feel exposed. Oh, isn't that funny? It's kind of the exposure on a negative, on a old-fashioned photograph, that we're in the shadow on the negative side, but then we're most seen through our vulnerability. So can you take us on your thinking from that vulnerability and I think interconnectedness? You were thinking everything's interconnected, to this show today talking about capital D dialogue. Were there some more steps between your 5-year-old Susan and where you are today, as I think you call yourself a dialogue ninja? Did I get that right?
Yes. Yeah, so absolutely there were thousands of steps, right?
Yeah.
And as part of that, kind of fast forwarding a bit, I really wanted to create harmony in people's lives and be a catalyst for that, excuse me, if you will. And so that took me to a place where I better understood what it truly means to be in relationship, but not just in relationship with other, what it truly means to be first in relationship with myself, and how that has a direct connection to being in relationship with other, but also being in relationship to what I call, the universe, and how that all comes to be from a place of wholeness. In other words, showing up in a way that, again, linking to what you just said with regard to Brene Brown, it comes with some of that vulnerability, right? Because vulnerability is the deepest point of human connection. And so, how can I be okay with showing up in ways that maybe don't feel so pleasant and yet are still incredibly authentic, linked to that piece that we just talked about around vulnerability and how that really connects us at a level linked to interconnectedness, right? This idea that we're all connected. And so, as I started to explore that in my younger adult years, I stumbled across because I was studying psychology, and I eventually became a psychotherapist. And as part of that, I learned about someone whose name is David Bohm. And I learned about David Bohm through one of his mentors and, frankly, one of his therapists, Patrick DeMare, in a way that helped me to start to understand what David Bohm was after with regard to harmony and with regard to what he was trying to do through what he called dialogue with a capital D, in a way that would connect people at that level, if you will, of vulnerability, at that place of shared meaning.
Wow. So you took us through, I think, were some of your foundational aha moments. And if it's okay with you, I would like Ash to bring up, who is this David Bohm and how is he so influential? Yeah. So tell us, a little bit about him, just in terms of a touchstone thought leader for you.
So David Bohm was actually a quantum scientist.
Mm-hmm.
And he was one of the people who, I guess in my own way of thinking about it, he proved this theory of interconnectedness based on some of the work that Einstein had actually done around the same topic. And so as part of that, when David Bohm realized in his own way what he felt the world needed with regard to how we all interact with each other, he created this process, this practice, what I actually call a state of being, dialogue. And he labeled it with a capital D because it's really not about conversation. It's about how we interact with each other in ways that suspend, put in front of us different opinions, different views. And in that, underpinned by some principles, create opportunities to not defend those points of views, but instead hold different points of views. So if we look at the slide right now, the way that Bohm talked about dialogue was this flowing conversation where all participants attempt to reach a common ground, what he called shared meaning, and what he felt was the glue that could hold a group together. And the way to reach shared meaning is actually through suspending different points of view. It's that creative tension, I think, that's required and needed to create a new understanding or a new reality. And so when you compare that to the definition of what dialogue is with a small d, it really has nothing to do with being in conversation. More so, it has to do with paying attention and understanding where we're coming from with regard to our assumptions, right? Our opinions, and how we're holding that in a way where we're not defending where there's a winner and a loser or someone is right or wrong, but instead just holding the tension, if you will, the creative tension that exists there to birth a new reality or a deeper understanding.
Well, as the slide definition showed, this is such a 180. Little d dialogue with the notions, some of the notions of percussion and fighting and and bouncing up against each other definitionally, whereas you're talking about state of being. Mm-hmm. And that, how does that take us on your journey to where you are today? How can we be on that journey with you, going from some of the principles you've talked about? How do we get interconnected? How do we, what is this capital D, dialogue and practice? What is it?
Absolutely. So I think it would be on, maybe if we show slide 6, there's some principles there that have been synthesized from some of the things that David Bohm talked about, right? These ideas that dialogue as a state of being is underpinned by some principles. And one of them is silence. And where that comes from is this idea that I think it was Stephen Covey who talked about this idea of listening and how most of us listen to reply instead of listening to fully understand. And so one of the things that I believe David Bohm brought to dialogue, again with the capital D, is this idea of listening to fully understand. Listening to other in a way that feels legitimate because you're genuinely curious and you really want to learn from what someone else has to say and share, especially if their worldview is different than yours or their opinion is different than yours. So when I think about silence, silence and listen contain the same letters in the English language. And so I don't think that's a coincidence, because how could we truly listen to understand without silence, and embracing silence as a way to learn from each other? And then from that place, this idea of, inquiry, beginner's mind, coming into any sort of interaction with one another in ways where I'm genuinely curious because I want to understand you, yes. And in that, I want to be curious about what you have to share in ways that I can learn something new, and how the sum of the parts is greater than one individual, right? And then suspension. David Bohm talked a lot about suspension, and not suspension from the perspective of setting things aside or maybe just pausing or kind of sweeping something under the rug. Quite the contrary. David Bohm talked about suspension from the perspective of hanging something right in front of you so that you can see it and examine it yourself, along with everybody else with whom you're interacting. Let's say it's a group or a team in an organization. So how can you put that out in front of you, literally, for everyone to respond and react to in a way then that doesn't defend it, but simply holds it, which then links to the last point here, which is self-examination, and doing that without judgment. In other words, doing it without the idea that there's something that is right or wrong or good or bad about it. David Bohm talked about dialogue in a way where he said, you have to create a space where there's no winner and there's no loser.
So we didn't talk about this, but I'm wondering, are there any current examples of how this looks in public media that you've observed, or anybody actually did this, or in your own consulting and coaching work, maybe without using names? Can you give us an example of how you shifted a dialogue from a percussion style at each other to how you operationalized creating the silence and having the big stepping back? When you talk about Native Americans, I know that there's the Ojai Native American group. Their version of dialogue is used today in Palestine between women, Israeli entrepreneurs, and Palestinian women entrepreneurs that I've worked with in my work at Peace Through Commerce. And they have the talking piece that comes from, there are probably other indigenous traditions. I know the Hawaiians have a talking protocol. They have a ho'oponopono for how we nurture each other and relax and come into relationships. So I know that our Native Americans have a lot of tradition and practice to teach us that I've experienced in real life. I mean, in a knockdown, drag out screaming match between women on both sides of the conflict. When the facilitators brought in the Ojai version of a talking stick, where it seemed to shift and recalibrate the energy in the room. So I did feel like they went from telling to listening.
Mm.
And I didn't think of it as a thing, on my way to being. And it's what I really like about what you're talking about is you're giving us steps to what our own best selves, our own evolution. So I shared a couple of my examples that I've seen that. Do you have any practical, tense situations that might have shifted or could have if you've been able to help them?
Well, absolutely. And I genuinely appreciate the question. So linking to, indigenous wisdom, if you will, what I hear you talking about is, as you were just speaking, Phyllis, is, this idea of slowing the cadence. So there's something more than the silence piece. There's this idea of kind of slowing things down as a way to really, again, listen and understand and inquire and do so in a way that participates with. And that was something that I just learned in a way that amplified everything that I believe about dialogue. Just last year on the summer solstice, when I co-facilitated a 24-hour dialogue session with 52 Indigenous leaders. And my biggest takeaway was this idea of what does it truly mean to participate with? So to come into any situation in a way where I don't have the answer and I'm okay with that. Beginner's mind, as was shown on the prior slide, and not trying to fix anything or kind of, in a way, curtail any sort of problem solving so that it creates a space where a different solution can emerge as opposed to be coming in having the answer. And I found that so striking with what these Indigenous leaders were sharing, even with regard to, Mother Earth herself, if you will. And this idea that we come into life, and especially in my humble opinion, we come into business in a way where we're paid to know the answers, right? As we climb that corporate ladder, so to speak, we're paid to know the answers. But what if we could just say we don't know? And what if we could do that in a way where everybody around us contributing and participating with us could come up with a different new reality, a different solution to what we think we know? And what could that generate? So I've seen that happen. I'll give a real life example. Some of the work that I've done in the past have been around big issues, like child malnutrition in India, for example. And this was an opportunity where we had people in the room who were of very, very diverse perspectives and basically a trisector approach. So we had the women of the children. We had corporate, if you will, represented. We had government represented. And in setting the conditions and using those principles as a way of being to have conversations about really, really meaningful and purposeful issues in the world, like child malnutrition in India, we were able for the first time ever to bring people together in a way that created that space of what Bohm called shared meaning. The very bond, the very glue, cement was another word that he used, where we realize we're more alike than separate. And because we all come from that place of a deeper understanding in a way that connects us, there's no solution that can't be manifest when we come at it in a space where we don't defend our own point of view. And I think that's what Bohm really meant when he talked about dialogue with the capital D. It's both and thinking instead of either or. It's harmony instead of defending.
You know what you remind me of? That we think that when you, and I'm just talking for me, but we might think that our agenda is to solve malnutrition in India, when what really wants to happen is to have all sectors and groups and societies just in conversation together. I mean, that might, in my opinion, that's everything. And then there's nothing we can't do together. And so if you create those conditions of like silence and inquiry and suspension and self-examination, if we're active listening that way, what we're doing is being together. And I mean, even if people starved, they would have done it to, I've heard it said sometimes the patient dies, but before they died, they were healed. That something extraneous might be happening, but there's a healing that goes on in the room that is so powerful and alive that it has its own integrity. And so let me try something. And if you want, this is just what I'm hearing. I wanted to ask you a question because I was reading up about Bohm, and one of his longtime friends and joint gurus, is an Indian philosopher thinker, Krishnamurti. And Bohm was asked if Krishnamurti was enlightened. And I want to read this to you because you've been so steeped in this. Bohm said, in some ways, yes, that his basic thing, Krishnamurti, was to go into thought, to get to the end of it completely. And then thought would become a different kind of consciousness. And I know I'm just throwing this out at you, but what I bring it up now because it feels to me like the consciousness changes in the room just when you have the big D dialogue without any outcome achieved. So I'm throwing a lot of balls in the air there. You feel free to jump in. What are you hearing?
Yeah, so I love that because one of the things that I learned from the works of David Bohm was this idea that thought is neutral. So all thought is neutral until we ascribe meaning to it. And then once we ascribe that meaning, the brain kind of kicks in, if you will, right? And labels it as good, bad, right, or wrong. And I believe what David Bohm was trying to accomplish through dialogue, the essence of it, so much so that he said he truly believed that dialogue could end war. It could create world peace. Why? Because when we don't defend, in other words, when we don't ascribe a label as right or wrong or good or bad to a thought, and we simply hold our differences, when we defend, we divide. And when we hold, we create harmony. And so that's what I hear in what you were describing about David Bohm and some of the conversations he had with Krishnamurti over 25 years, right? Mm-hmm. And bringing that spiritual, I would say that emotional spiritual component into the whole process, which again, for me, linked to this idea of a way of being instead of sitting in a circle, having a conversation underpinned by a set of principles. Mm-hmm. It truly is recognizing and becoming more self-aware of how I am interacting and what I'm bringing to the larger group in ways that can I would say in ways that can bring disharmony instead of creating spaces where I'm open and in a way understanding that there is so much more than what I know. And I think that's what Krishnamurti brought to David Bohm, the unknown, if you will, right?
Yes. And Ash was showing that last slide of your,
yes.
So I love you use the nautilus, which is that perfect geometric logarithm in nature that is
Right.
ideal, and you're stepping up the staircase. So we started with the 5-year-old Susan, who stepped using those principles of harmony, interconnectedness. You shift, and then finding Bohmian cavalry dialogue, and then moving, as you just so well described, moving into a way of being,
Right.
being rather than doing.
Yes.
So I loved how you shared with us today,
Thank you.
Susan. I wish I could have been a fly on the wall in some of those large facilitated dialogues that you've hosted, and I think the world is so uh, uh, honored and lucky to have you doing the work that you and Generon are doing.
Thank you.
So with that, I'll have to leave it there for today. I want to let everyone know that you have been watching The Creative Life on ThinkTech Hawaii. Our guest, Susan Taylor, who's the CEO of Generon International, has taken us into a journey to chase the light. And it would be done through an evolved form of dialogue based on the work of physicist David Bohm, but based on her work and the team at Generon as well. We've learned that it's so much more to have a conversation that's underpinned with a set of principles of silence and suspension, than it is to just talk at each other, and that it is truly a practice and a fully immersive way of being, our own way of being that we can discover, and that together we could transform the world. So mahalo, Susan, for joining us. Mahalo to our viewers for tuning in. I'm Phyllis Blees, and we'll be back in 2 weeks for another edition of The Creative Life. Aloha.
Thank you so much for watching ThinkTech Hawaii. If you like what we do, please like us and click the subscribe button on YouTube and the follow button on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn, and donate to us at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.